Dmytro Snegiryev, military and political analyst, is already with us live. Welcome, Dmytro.
Good evening and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Gaveman, thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us. Let's start with the situation at the front. What is changing? How is the dynamic shifting? And where are the hottest spots on the front lines today? As we understand it, Kiev endured this attack without any real military objective whatsoever. The Putin doesn't even have any plans to capture the entire Donbass. And to what extent is he failing at even that?
It should be noted that the strike on Kyiv is a continuation of the so-called tactic of city warfare. This tactic was used by Soviet special services during the Iran-Iraq War, when the front line was basically stable. And accordingly, on the advice of Soviet advisors, specifically employees of the KGB, Iraq changed its combat tactics, striking exclusively at residential areas of Iraqi cities. In world military history, this became known as the tactic of the War of Cities. Accordingly, at this point, Putin fully understands that as of August 2026, the front line has barely changed compared to August 2025. He has switched to a tactic of terror against the civilian population by striking exclusively at residential infrastructure. As for the front line, it should be noted that the most intense situation is precisely on the Donetsk front. This includes the Konstantinovka, Lyman, and Pokrovsk directions. In the Konstantinivka direction, despite all the Russian side's statements about full control over the city, the situation is exactly the opposite. There are attempts by the occupiers to break through directly in the area of private housing. This includes the Hill and the so-called Shanghai area, plus infiltration by small assault groups on the western outskirts of the city. In addition, the occupiers have achieved certain tactical successes in the area, in the Chatsiv Yar area. But it should be noted that Ukraine's defense forces are conducting raid operations to prevent further advances by the Russian occupiers. Moreover, at this moment, the actual line of contact runs through the center of the city. This is Soborna Street, which completely disproves the Russian side's claim of full control over the settlement. And it's also worth noting that Ukraine's defense forces have deployed additional UAV operator units to the Kostiantynivka direction, which allows them to hold their positions and, accordingly, inflict massive damage and losses on the occupiers' personnel and equipment. Regarding changes in tactics, it's worth noting that in the Dobrapilya direction, the occupiers, realizing that after 2 years of fighting they still haven't managed to take the so-called Pokrovsky direction, have shifted from the tactic of small assault groups infiltrating to direct attacks using large numbers of armored vehicles and manpower. Moreover, I want to point out that these attacks have been unsuccessful. Even the Russian side admits that, in the context of modern warfare, which Ukraine's defense forces are demonstrating so effectively, particularly with these so-called kill zones, such attacks are suicidal. This is telling. Moreover, the occupiers themselves admit to losing more than 20 pieces of armored equipment. These include tanks, IFVs, APCs, and most importantly, the loss of several dozen Russian servicemen. These are enormous losses, especially considering that Ukraine's defense forces destroyed the assault columns literally within a few hours. So, despite all the occupiers' attempts to break through the Ukrainian defense forces' lines in the Dobrapilya, or as it's also called Pokrovsk direction, they have had no success.
Dmytro, actually, you basically anticipated our next question. But look, they really are starting to admit to these enormous losses themselves. Well, look, the American Institute for the Study of War says very clearly and plainly that the Russian military command is lying to their dictator Putin about these supposed successes, whether in the north, the northeast, or the east of Ukraine. They just lie constantly. And surely they're doing the same thing, probably, when it comes to the situation with resources. Well, look, just in the past 24 hours, there have been 1,470 fewer Russian occupiers, and since the start of the full-scale invasion, that's a total of 1,447,000. And attention, the Russian occupation army suffered record losses in just the recently ended month of July. 42,860 people. What do you think? Why did they choose this tactic of constantly lying to their main patron, their main Kremlin gangster? What purpose? Are they simply motivated by fear, or are they trying to achieve some kind of specific advantage from this constant web of deception that they choose to inhabit every single day?
It should be noted that this is a tactic not only of the Russian military, but also, accordingly, of the Russian political leadership and the Russian dictator himself. Total lies. Moreover, he lies even during meetings with so-called veterans of the special military operation, literally leaving people who have just come from the front in a state of shock, people who fully understand the situation on the front line and the impossibility of breaking through the Ukrainian defenses. This is very telling. In other words, the very tactics of the Kremlin's political leadership are to try, due to, well, the lack of alternative sources of information. And let me remind you, just this past week, there have been new attempts by the Russian authorities to impose total censorship over Durov's telegram. They announced suspicion. Plus, of course, pressure on the so-called independent Russian media. So, by using the tactic of an information vacuum, the Russian dictator lies to the entire Russian population. He needs to justify the fact that after 5 years of large-scale invasion, the Russian army, despite its numerical superiority, superiority in firepower, superiority in heavy armored vehicles, and even, finally, superiority in the Russian Federation's economy, has not managed to achieve even tactical-level successes, let alone strategic ones. There's no longer any talk of denazification or demilitarization. Moreover, the Russian military themselves note that in the 5th year, the so-called demilitarization has boomeranged back on the Russian Federation itself, with up to 40% of Russian oil refineries destroyed. In other words, the capabilities of Ukraine's defense industry have increased many times over compared to 2022. And in order to hide these successes of the Ukrainian side, in recent months, Ukraine's defense forces have seized the tactical initiative in several areas of the front. Moreover, the so-called buffer zone tactic has failed. The Russian dictator is lying, blatantly lying to the Russian people about the supposed successes of the Russian army. These statements about capturing Konstantinovka, these statements about breaking through to Slovyansk, capturing Lyman, capturing Kupiansk, and all these Ukrainian cities he only captures with his mouth. The reality of the situation on the front line shows that both Kupiansk, Slovyansk, Lyman, and Konstantinovka are under the control of Ukraine's defense forces.
And let's also talk about what's happening not on land, but at sea. So in the Black Sea, the floating container ship Lenina, owned by Rosatom, sank. A vessel with a capacity of over 100,000 tons went down after an attack by naval drones. At first, Russian media reported this, and then the fact of the strike was confirmed by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. He also thanked Ukraine's defense forces for their accuracy. And we know they're not sleeping.
Grateful to Ukraine.
We know that Tukumedyar isn't sleeping either. They work regularly, day and night, and strike the occupied territory of Crimea. We'll also be talking about this with our guest. Dmitry Snegryov is already with us on the air. Let's discuss what's happening in Crimea and to what extent the strategically important floating military assets for the Russian Federation are no longer afloat. How much have we managed to reduce their ability to launch those same missiles that Ukraine from the sea?
Yes, there have been significant successes there. First and foremost, in terms of the economic blockade, it should be noted that Ukrainian drones have struck more than 100 energy facilities in Crimea. The situation with power supply in occupied Crimea is extremely difficult, and as a result, there are also problems with potable and technical water, as well as issues with public transportation and even the banking system. If we talk about strikes on legitimate military targets, then over the past week, Ukraine's defense forces have carried out a number of successful attacks on the enemy's air defense systems. Moreover, it should be noted that just yesterday, drone operators from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense destroyed a Pantsir S-1 surface-to-air missile system and the main vessel from the Black Sea Fleet. This was a patrol boat of the Sorgan project. This is quite a remarkable success. In other words, we're talking about the actual destruction of the active defenses of Russian military sites, which are legitimate military targets. These are air defense systems and, accordingly, the remnants of the Black Sea Fleet. Why do I say remnants? According to British intelligence, over this entire period, Ukraine's defense forces have destroyed more than 40% of the Black Sea Fleet's vessels, effectively putting an end to its existence. Moreover, the British side also notes that the capabilities of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet have been reduced to a historic minimum, and the Russian Federation has been forced to essentially lock up the remnants of the Black Sea Fleet in the port of Novorossiysk. At this point, both Kerch and Sevastopol, which are key for the Russian Federation as repair bases and accordingly as permanent deployment points for the Black Sea Fleet, have been effectively lost. It should also be noted that strikes are being carried out not only against the Black Sea Fleet's vessels, but most importantly, against its infrastructure. The headquarters and command posts of the Black Sea Fleet, according to the Russian Federation's own assessment, have now been relocated to Novorossiysk. This is a telling sign. In other words, it's quite telling that the Rats, that is the military command, were the first to run away. And it's also worth noting a number of successful strikes by Ukraine's defense forces. First and foremost, these are strikes by unmanned systems against vessels. Let me emphasize again, this includes the destruction of platforms used to launch interceptor drones, which reduces the ability to shoot down Ukrainian UAVs, as well as strikes against vessels. The ferry crossing that connected occupied Crimea with Russian Kerch has been completely destroyed. It should be noted that out of 8 ferries, both railway and automobile, 6 have been completely destroyed. The Russian side was forced to admit a complete blockade and the impossibility of delivering both civilian and, above all, military cargo from Russia's Taman region to the territory of occupied Crimea. This is a brilliant operation by the Ukrainian defense forces.
Dmitry, but really, all that we're discussing and listing here, record losses of equipment, record losses of personnel, the lack of any real successes at the front, and, in fact, the effect of raids by Ukrainian drones, and not just drones, deep into the rear of the Russian Federation. All of this should really have a significant impact on the Kremlin gang's negotiating position. What do you think, considering one of the latest statements by U.S. Secretary of State Rubio that the United States will try to resume negotiations between Ukraine and Russia literally in the coming weeks? What position do you think this Moscow mob will take in this situation?
We're talking about actually forcing Moscow. No one's interested in Moscow's opinion anymore. Notice, it's not even about Rubio's statements anymore. In fact, Trump even said that there's no talk of any anchorage spirit because Ukraine's interests haven't been taken into account. That's very telling. This is a major shift in rhetoric, first and foremost not from representatives of the White House administration, but from the President of the United States himself, who is talking about the possibility of ending the war with Ukraine's interests in mind. In other words, Russia's demands are essentially being dismissed. Their nuclear saber rattling, their provocations like missiles flying into Polish territory during the Ukrainian president's visit, and accordingly, the United States in meetings with the Polish counterpart, as well as other provocations from the Russian side. Note that the response from both NATO and the United States is unequivocal: pressure on the Russian Federation. Plus, all of this is happening against the backdrop of a possible second vote in the House of Representatives on the late Senator Graham's bill for so-called fiery sanctions against the Russian Federation's economy. And that would already indicate a complete collapse of the Russian economy.
And considering how they've started talking about the possible end of the special military operation, it's clear they're afraid of those very sanctions. Lindsey Graham knew exactly what he was doing. Dmitry, thank you very much for this conversation. Dmitry Snigarev, military and political analyst, was with us live.